Rather more than 2,000 years ago, these great stone walls were built by the Saluvii, one of the Gallic tribes that fought constantly over these parts of southern France. The walls were built to protect their hilltop settlement of Entremont. In the 2nd century BC, this now deserted site was a thriving town. It was well situated, with the ground falling away steeply on one side, so an enemy could be seen coming miles away. Below the hill, the Romans were to found their first settlement in Gaul, now the busy town of Aix-en-Provence, while 20 miles to the south lay the Greek colony of Marseille. Marseille was a prosperous port for 6 centuries before Christ. Massalia, as it was called, was a settlement of Greeks who had come from Asia Minor. It became the most important trading city west of Italy. So Gallic and Greek settlements existed side by side. Rome's arrival on the scene, almost by accident, was the catalyst that produced something unmistakably Roman, but with a flavour very much its own. This programme is about the fusion of cultures in Mediterranean France that made up Augustus's Gallia Narbonensis. In the 2nd century BC, Rome had finally destroyed Carthage and taken over her possessions in Spain. The main link between Rome and Spain was by sea, but most shipping in the ancient world needed to hug the coast, so Rome depended for the safety of this route on the friendship of the Greek colonies along the Riviera, Nice, Antibes, Marseille and others, and on westwards to Ampurias in Spain. There were also land routes, but communications by land were difficult due to hostile tribes in the Western Alps. And even after crossing the Alps, the problems weren't over. Further tribes, like the Saluvii at Entremont, threatened the land routes. So the need to defend the routes to her Spanish possessions made it inevitable that Rome was brought into closer and closer contact with both Greeks and Celts in Mediterranean France. We can get some idea of Gallic culture from the sculptures and reliefs found at Entremont and now preserved in local museums. The Saluvii were one of a group of peoples who had lived originally in the lands of North Italy and southern Gaul. They were strongly influenced by the Celts and by the 2nd century BC had come to be seen as Celtic. The characteristic Celtic torque or neck ring can be clearly seen on this stone torso. Torques were of high significance for the Celts, and we find magnificent examples all over the Celtic world, even as far away as Britain. These gold torques may have formed part of the royal jewels of tribal rulers, or adorned the images of their gods. In this relief of a warrior horseman, found at Entremont, we can just make out the severed head of an enemy hanging from the bridle. Headhunting was common amongst the Celtic peoples and was actually part of religious worship. On the site at Entremont, the remains of the city's shrine reveal the cult of the severed head, here represented in sculptured form. For the Celts, the head was the repository of the soul as well as the intellect. The Greek traveller Posidonius found the display of heads in Celtic settlements disturbing at first, but said, "You got used to it." The skulls of captured enemies were often incorporated into shrines. This one, now reconstructed, was found at Roc Pertuse, not far from Entremont. The seated deities are typical native work, right down to the checkerboard decoration on their shoulders. The impression is of a cult belonging to a primitive and savage people. Yet was this head-hunting culture really so strange to a Greek or Roman visitor? It comes as a surprise to wander through the ruins of Entremont. There are none of the primitive huts one normally associates with the Celts, Instead, we find the remains of solid, square, stone-built houses constructed on a regular street pattern. Here and there, small rooms open direct onto the roadway, a shop perhaps, or workshop. Other houses were more elaborate. Passages run back from the entrance into courtyards, and the main rooms were grouped round these in typical classical style. In one of them, we even find the remains of an oil press, a real hallmark of Mediterranean culture. There are also several ovens or furnaces. You might think they were made of Roman tiles, and on a Roman site they would be. But in fact, these are broken pieces of the Italian jars in which various prized imports came to the Celts. This isn't the hill-fort world of central or northern Gaul or of Britain. It's the urban world of the Mediterranean. As visitors, we might well have expected something surprising from the great stone walls with their half-round bastions. The masonry isn't admittedly of the superb standard of Greek fortifications in the area, but the layout and construction are sophisticated. We're obviously dealing with a culture that looks south to the Mediterranean and not north. Indeed, the Saluvii coveted neighbouring Greek possessions and often attacked them. The Greeks of Marseille appealed to Rome for help, and a Roman army attacked Entremont and destroyed it in 123 BC. The walls were no match for Roman military science. After their victory, the Romans founded their own fortress settlement of Aquae Sextiae, now Aix-en-Provence, on the spring line below the hill. Their presence soon embroiled them in conflicts with other local tribes, and it became impossible to withdraw. Gaul was to remain part of the Roman world for 6 centuries. It was their most brilliant acquisition of the time, known first as Provincia Gallia Transalpina, or more simply, as the province, now Provence. 35 miles northwest of Entremont and Aix lies Glanum. Here again we find a mixture of Greek and Gallic in what the Romans took over, but this time the proportions are reversed. The population seems mainly Gallic in origin, and its religious practices chiefly Celtic, but its material culture is overwhelmingly Greek, under the dominating influence of Marseille. How did the town come to be such a mixture of cultures? Glanum lies on the extreme northern edge of the Alpi. It's a long, narrow town, straddling an ancient road down the gorge through the hills. This gorge and road explain the importance of the site, where it stands at a point where the lesser coastal land route from Italy meets the Great Road from Spain. To understand Glanum, we need to understand the 3 main periods represented by the visible remains here on site. Before the town, Glanum was already a Celtic religious centre, like Roquepertuis, but here we're chiefly concerned with Glanum the town. Glanum I was a Greek town, incorporating the old Celtic shrines. At the top of the town was the religious area. In the centre were the public buildings, including a small council chamber. And on the flatter ground, as the site opens up, were a number of compact Greek-style houses. Glanum I was developed in the course of the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC and was destroyed around 110 BC, probably by Celtic and German invaders. Glanum II is the town rebuilt, still predominantly in the Greek style, but influenced by the Romans of the late Republic, who were now the dominant power. The scale is still small, but there are some fine houses and public baths. Glanum III is the town heavily modified, embellished and generally Romanized under the Emperor Augustus and his successors. On the small scale of the old town are now superimposed the impressive public buildings associated with imperial influence, a forum, basilica, temples, and a theatre. Imagine we are travellers in Augustan times, just arrived through the hills from the south. Let's stop first at the Temple of Health, Valitudo. Continuing a pre-Roman cult into Roman times, it bears the mark of Augustus's chief lieutenant, M for Marcus, Agrippa. Going back along the base of the temple, we descend to the sacred spring. Healing cults and water were very often associated in Romano-Celtic religion, here as at Bath, and for that reason we shall not be at all surprised to find the Celtic talk reappearing here on this very Roman temple. The eventual cultural mix under the Romans is well illustrated in this temple area. Here by the roadside is an altar to the god Glan and the Glanicae, the god and goddesses who looked after the place, and to Fortuna Redux, Fortune who brought one home safely, and it was set up by Marcus Licinius Claudius Verecundus, a veteran of the 21st Legion Rapax. That was one of the legions raised after Quintilius Varus lost those 3 legions in the disaster in AD 9. Lower down, outside the sacred area, the hand of Rome is dramatically displayed. Here we're in the modest council chamber of the Greek town, with its benches for the councillors and its central altar. Right across it, obliterating the little building, is the foundation of a Roman temple, one of a pair in honour of the imperial family. Across the street is an equally impressive example. The little Greek council chamber was replaced by a typically Roman forum and basilica complex. What strikes one is the enormous scale of the basilica. Facing it, across the colonnaded forum, the curved foundation of the central niche that once held an imperial statue survives. Note the massive masonry of very high quality. At the other end, one of the huge piers that once supported the basilica itself rests, like an elephant's foot, on the floor of an earlier Republican house. At the back of the basilica, we can still see the apsed room where we may suppose the Roman-sponsored successor to the old Hellenized Gallic council met. The courtyard outside was a public open space. The basilica served the law and administration. But where did the councillors live? It's interesting to find these pleasant Greek houses, further down the street, restored and altered, but still occupied in Roman times. The upper classes of Augustan Glanum were comfortably housed, with courtyards round pools and handsomely decorated dining rooms. Who were the people who lived in these elegant houses? Just outside the built-up area, in the usual position reserved for cemeteries, a local family, the Julii, notables who from their name must have received the citizenship from Caesar or Augustus, left their mark in this family monument. At the top, under the conical roof, is a pair of family statues. The monument is still clearly labelled, Sextus, Lucius and Marcus, the Julii, sons of Pius, set this up in honour of their parents. Lower down, the main panels, based on the conventional mythical scenes of classical warriors fighting barbarians, only too obviously show Roman troops of the Caesarean period fighting Gauls. Passers-by were left in little doubt as to which side the townspeople were on. The upper classes of Glarnham were definitely locals, happy to adopt the manners and attitudes of their Roman masters, with whom they were to fuse within the next century. The crowning monument of their civic pride was the Roman arch, spanning the road at the northern entrance to the town. It's fared worse over the years than the mausoleum alongside, though it's still impressive. Its original shape is shown by this reconstruction. It's in the form of a triumphal arch, but there's little doubt that it is in fact a municipal monument rather than a Roman war memorial. Yet its principal decoration celebrates Gaul conquered and captured, trousered Gaulish warriors and their wives in chains. The defeat of such long-haired warriors was clearly welcomed by the more Hellenized natives. Protected by the Augustan peace, the notables of Glarnham certainly waxed fat on the situation of their town. Westwards beyond Glarnham, the Alpi dwindle and the landscape flattens towards the Rhone, just the sort of countryside suited to Roman colonisation. Distant uplands for summer pasture with timber for building and fuel. On the slopes, space for olives, herbs and bees. A little lower down, vineyards. And out on the plain, land for cereals or grazing animals. A similar pattern of agriculture supports the population today. Running through these fields and vineyards is the remains of an aqueduct designed to serve the Roman colonists 15 miles away at Arles. It was an ingenious piece of engineering. To be precise, there were two aqueducts. As the channels reached a ridge in the hills, one turned sharply towards Arles and ran along just under the crest. But the second channel was driven through a cutting in the rock towards the south side of the ridge. On the far side, the land drops away almost sheer to the plain, known today as the Crow. As we pass through the cutting, something quite extraordinary appears below. We can see that the aqueduct has divided again and seems to disappear into a jumbled mass of walls. If we look from the other side, we find a series of giant steps, and at each level a kind of chamber. Into each chamber would have fitted a mill wheel. There can be no doubt that we have here the remains of a water-powered mill. The principle of the machine was described by the Augustan architectural writer Vitruvius. If we look at the whole monument again, we see that the channel flows through the hill and divides, passing over 8 pairs of chambers, one above the other, so there must have been 16 mill wheels in all. It's important to assess what all this adds up to. It is, of course, a huge piece of industrial archaeology, a factory no less. In full production, this mill could probably feed 80,000 people, so that gives us some idea of the level of administration in a Roman province. The mill and aqueducts supplied the Roman settlement at Arles, one of the group of colonies founded by Julius Caesar and by Augustus for the veterans of their legions. And the mill, whose exact date is uncertain, may nevertheless be linked to one of the most extraordinary surviving monuments of Augustan Arles, the Cryptoporticus, or hidden portico. A number of these underground structures have been found in different parts of the empire, and their purpose is disputed, but it's most likely to have been for bulk storage of grain. If grain was stored here, it must have been in very large quantities. The vault has 3 legs, each about 300 feet long, the length of a medieval cathedral. We can get some idea of the scale of the Cryptoporticus from the fact that it supported the forum which occupied this site. Arles, in Augustan times, was obviously a major city. The amphitheatre, a little later in date, was a major amenity probably added to the city under Nero. One of a series of vast amphitheatres in Provence, it seated 25,000 spectators. The seats are arranged in tiers over walkways at different levels for circulation, access to the auditorium, and for bringing in the participants in the various types of show that were staged here: gladiatorial combats, wild animal displays, and the execution of criminals. The present floor is well below the original, at the level of the cells in which the animals or prisoners were confined. In Roman times, the arena had a wooden floor above, supported on stone piers. Delimiting the arena, high slabs protected the audience and bore inscriptions recording the magistrates who had paid for games. The front seats were reserved for priests and officials. Behind them came the associations of shippers and merchants, and at the back, students. Across the main street, the theatre is certainly a creation of the Augustan period. 7,500 people could be accommodated in the auditorium. The level space known as the orchestra is semicircular, following the Roman rather than the Greek pattern. It provided an arc of seating for important people, and in the centre, on the coloured floor, an altar to Augustus's favourite god, Apollo. At the back of the stage was an elaborate stone backdrop. Its centre was dominated by a statue of the emperor himself. The stage floor was of wood, resting on these parallel walls. In front, the rigid curtain could be wound up by machinery. A Gaulish visitor from Glarnham must have been overwhelmed by the obvious triumph of classical culture and the inescapable reality of Augustus's power. These monuments bear witness to the consolidation of power, which ensured the safety and stability of the state and the glory and security of the Julian house. We've come a long way in outlook, if only a short distance in time and space, from the hilltop tribesmen of Entremont or the small-town Greeks of pre-Augustan Glarnham.